True Tales of the Rails. Actual happenings told by eyewitnesses. Railroad Magazine, April 1938. The Little Red Caboose by Haywire Mac. To the old-time trainman, boomer, or home guard, there are no fonder memories than those clustering around the little digging car that carries the markers on the rear end of a freight. It is the captain's cabin, the fo'c'sle, the crow's nest of the lookout, and the galley. The Caboose was the original house trailer. So well it was designed in the beginning that very few changes have been made since the markers were hung out on the first crummy to click over the rails. It has a cupola, or crock loft, from which the conductor and the rear-end chap keep a watchful eye on the train and the order boards. It has a desk for the pencil works, racks for waybills and reports, and an order hook, all located in the warmest spot on the Caboose, right across from the stove. Also bunks with oilcloth cushions, which hide lockers for the storage of chains, knuckles, wrecking frogs, jacks, brasses, and buckets of dope for first aid to hot boxes, and closets for spare clothing, a pantry for food, a water cooler, and an ice box. You also have a water tank, a wash basin, and a mirror, a coal box, and a stove. And what a stove! Remember that night long ago when it was snowing, a wet, nasty snow so thick that you had to relay signals? You were setting out a car at some whistle stop and you shoved 'em off the end of the house track. And, of course, when you pulled 'em ahead of the rear trucks, missed the rail by 2 feet. So you had to lug the frogs up and wallow in the mud and slush until you were soaked to the skin before the accursed thing was re-railed. Your hindmen had to go back and flag. Your headman was a student. Them was happy days, my lads, but before leaving, the good old rear shack had thrown a charge into the heater and thrown the drafts down wide open. When you finally got the car on the iron, and the frogs loaded, and the flag called in, you gave 'em the hogger and the old take-away token. Then you opened the door of the crummy, and there was the stove, with the top white-hot and the stovepipe cherry-red clear to the roof, and the paint on the nearest wall curling up in little blisters. And did that stove look good to you on that cold snowy night? I remember breaking ahead for an old fellow who had a lot of trouble with the hind shack about the proper method of firing a Caboose stove. The shack was getting old and he was kind of skinny and thin-blooded. He'd sit up in the cupola and watch the trains and darn near freeze when the brains rode warm and easy on the conductor's desk in front of the heater. Every time the con would leave the Caboose, Mr. Shack would bail in a charge that almost melted the stove. But he'd be comfortable for a while. The captain would sweat until the fuel was almost burned out, and he'd practically let the fire die before he'd throw in another chunk of coal. Finally, they had a showdown. "Cap," says the shack, "either you let me fire that stove, or I bid off this run, and that's plumb final." "Tom," replies the skipper, "you're a good man, and I'd hate to lose you. But damn it, man, you keep that stove so darn hot that I can't get close enough to get warm to it." I once had a regular run on the Pensy with a partner who was a homeless boomer like myself. Nearly all the crews slept in the Caboose when away from their home terminal, so we decided against paying room rent for the place that we were in for about 6 days a month, and we proceeded to fix ourselves up nice and comfortable. The crummies on that pike were painted a sort of sickly cream color inside, and every finger mark showed. We mooched the paint shop foreman for enough paint to prime, grain, and varnish that hack until it shone like a Dutch woman's kitchen. The ceiling and cupola were dark green and the walls an imitation oak grade. We had white curtains at the windows and rugs on the floor when we were in port. It kept us so busy that we quit going uptown for a few beers in the evening. First thing we knew, we were accumulating a stake. Finally, we got her finished. There were pictures on the wall, and the coal box was painted green. With a red and yellow star in the front, we had a rolling home that had some private cars beat. We even jacked her up and oiled the springs until she rode like a buggy. Living in surroundings like that had its effect on us. We kept our overalls washed, and the con took to wearing a white collar. Yes, sir, we were the pride of the division. Even the trainmaster heard about it and took a ride over the line with us. But it was too good to last. My partner did a job of short flagging one night, and another extra piled into us. The Caboose went up in smoke. My partner got fired, and I quit. The next job I condescended to accepted was breaking behind a shay on the old Tacoma and Eastern. There were no varnished cabooses on that line. You rode out on the logs with cocks in your shoes, and you held them down the grade with a 4-foot sap. Down on the NC and STL, or the grandpa, as the boomers called it, they used to have an unpaid member of the crew called the caboose helper. He was just an ambitious colored boy who attached himself to the crew. He cleaned the lamps, polished the windows, and kept the caboose spotless. He cooked, washed dishes, and always had the conductor's clothes brushed and his shoes shined before the drag pulled into a terminal. For all this, he received his meals when on the road and a couple of dollars from each member of the crew on payday. This may seem queer to you, but all here is the explanation. Lots of railroads in the South hired Negro brakemen in those days, but they wouldn't bother with breaking in green men. After a colored boy had put in 5 or 6 months on the grandpa, his conductors would give him a letter to whom it may concern, stating that the bearer was a qualified brakeman. And you can bet all the cotton in Georgia that he was. Some of the best hand cars I ever saw were the Negro brakemen and switchmen on the railroads in Dixieland. They were men of standing in the community and the backbone of the colored fraternal order organizations. Incidentally, a conductor or engineer was no small pumpkins in southern town. Socially, they rated with the doctors and lawyers. Financially, they were better off than most storekeepers. The conductor was always addressed as captain, and the gold-braided commander of a passenger train was on familiar terms with governors and senators. On the NC and STL, the captain rated a private stateroom made by partitioning off one end of the caboose. This was usually kept locked, but, locked or not, the brakemen were not supposed to go through it. If that end was against the train and the shack wanted to go over ahead, he climbed up the ladder from the rear platform and went over the top. On many western roads, the caboose track is a sort of social center for the crews away from home. Social activities usually center around card games, in which the gambling angle is not always absent. About the poker players' bunch I ever ran into was the gang around Laramie, Wyoming, during the winter of 1916. I have seen nearly $1,000 on the seat cushion that served as a table, and if a booner happened to get lucky in a game like that, he could lay off and take a trip to the coast. Of course, there were always plenty of gambling houses in Laramie, but the rails preferred the caboose track games because there was no house rake-off, and the Laramie houses ranked plenty. I watched those games for 2 months without touching a card, figuring that those brothers were a little too tough for me. But one night I sat in, feeling very lucky, and I lost $30, all I had, in 2 hands. I cursed myself all the way back to Denver and back. When we got in our next trip, we were caught in a great snow blockade and held in Laramie for nearly a week. There were 11 westbound passenger trains tied up in Laramie Yard. 5 more were stuck in the snow around Rock Creek and Hannah. Laramie was full of folks looking for diversions, so I horned into a crap game in the saloon one night. Had a run of luck and more than got even. I quit when I returned to Denver, and within a week I was hitting a footboard for the short line in Salt Lake City. Some of these days I'm going back and take another fall out of those Laramie shacks. The Oregon Short Line did not encourage the practice of sleeping in cabooses. They had bulletins up stating that employees who saved room rent in that manner did so at their own risk, and the switchmen handled them like boxcars. They'd cut 'em off and let 'em roll. When a train crew took a drag out, they usually found everything movable against the door next to the train. Back in 1911, the D and RGW had a lot of boxcar cabooses. No cupolas, just a decrepit brownie with some lockers in the stove. Trains leaving Helper for Soldier Summit would have one gin on the head end and one in the middle and another bringing up the rear. To save a move at the top of the hill, those trainmen used a couple of mallet on behind one of those boxcar crummies and then get in and ride. The poor old boxcars would hump up in the middle and almost buckle under the strain. This worked the nails out of the roof until it looked like a porcupine's back. Also, it opened up cracks in the sides and floors that you could have thrown a good-sized dog through. As one boomer expressed it, riding a Rio Grande caboose is just a polite way of staying outdoors. However, they were strictly an emergency proposition and were soon replaced by up-to-date wagons with steel underframes. These reconciliations would scarcely be complete without a mention of a caboose track cookery. It must all be done on top of the stove, although some railroads in the South equip their caboose with a regular ship's range and oven and all. This is probably because no true-hearted Southerner ever eats any kind of bread except cornbread and biscuits. I have seen ranges in Western Pacific crummies and oil stoves in the SP, but they were all installed by the crews at their own expense. So we'll assume that all the cooking is done on top of the stove. First requirement is a kettle. Not a tall, narrow pot, but a low, squatty one that won't upset easy when the hogger makes a rough stop. It should have had a good tight lid with a flange to keep it from sliding off. I used to pick up a lighted piece of chain and fasten it to the roof directly over the stove. You can then suspend your kettle so that the top rests lightly on the stove. If the yard crew takes a notion to switch the caboose track while dinner is cooking, the old mulligan will remain right upside with care. When buying skillets, get the cast iron or heavy steel kind, as the light 10-cent store variety will scorch your chow before it's heated through. An old-fashioned Dutch oven often enables you to turn out pot-roast fish for a king. Just get your oven hot, put in plenty of grease, and sear your meat well, turning it frequently. After that, pour in a couple quarts of water, add 2 or 3 onions, a carrot, and a bit of garlic if you like. Then clap the lid on and let her simmer slowly for about 3 hours. Put more water in from time to time if needed. About 20 minutes before mealtime, add your peeled suds, and be sure to invite the traveling brother who is riding with you to get in on the feast. Round steak is better fried, but if you get a hold of a good sirloin or porterhouse, try pan broiling it. Use no grease, just dust the hot pan with salt, slap in your steak, and turn underside until the underside is done. Better cook your potatoes first and have them all ready. If there are a lot of ashes under the grates, you can bury your spuds down deep and bake them. One of my favorite ways of cooking spuds is the caboose track fry. Slice potatoes and onions, put in skillet with plenty of grease, and fry until about half done. Then pour in a cup or 2 of water and steam till done, covering with a tight lid, of course. You'll find that they'll beat the spuds and they'll serve in the beanery. Of course, if you don't figure on staying where you are much longer than the next payday, you won't want to fix up the crummy with an elaborate outfit of culinary utensils. In that case, you could always make a mulligan in a 5-gallon oil can. I have cooked in a new dope bucket. To make a frying pan, cut the ends out of the 5-gallon oil can, split it down one corner. Now you have a nice piece of tin. Flatten it out on the floor, double it, flatten it again. Now turn the edges up about an inch all around, and there you are, a fair-sized skillet with a double bottom that will not scorch your grub easily. You can broil a steak right on top of the stove. Just wash the top off good with a hunk of wet waste. Get her hot, but not too hot. Sprinkle your stove lid with salt and slap on your steak. I learned that one from an old Chinaman who had a pie card sign up at Gerlach, Nevada. His joint was noted for good steaks, and that's the way he cooked them. If the steak was cut a little thin, he'd set a flat iron on top to keep the edges from curling up. One time I was breaking on local freight between Alliance and Mansfield, Ohio, when Yuletide rolled around. Business was good on that road, and we had been notified that we would have to work Christmas Day, so we planned on a big feed in the crummy. One of the gang won a turkey in a raffle, and we had the best cook at Alliance roast it for us the day before the oyster dressing and all the trimmings. All the hindmen had to do was warm up and serve. Millbrook had a water plug and coal chute, so we decided to tie it up at that long point, long enough just to do justice to the feast. Just before reaching it, we picked up a bunch of chains out of Worcester. There were 5 cars, all chained together, and there must have been 30 feet of slack in that rear. As we pulled up to the coal chute, the turkey in the big roasting pan was on the stove, steaming hot and filling the air with its fragrance. The potatoes were mashed, the coffee made, the gravy ready. The rear end shack was setting the table. But the idiot of a hogger forgot all about those chain-ups. He spotted the engine while the caboose was still moving in at about 10 miles per hour. The slack ran up with a wham that you could have heard for a mile. The shack landed on the seat of his britches against the front door. The coal box caught some of the banquet, and the rest was evenly and impartially distributed between the hind shack and the floor. There were grease, turkey, cranberry sauce, and broken dishes all over that end of the caboose. The hind shack arose, dripping with gravy and standing on a pool of coffee, and delivered an oration for the subject of hogsheads in general, and ours in particular. He spoke at length and with feeling. He discussed their maternal ancestry, their present conduct, and their probable fate at the hands of an outraged universe. Before he had more than hit his full stride, the con and I were standing at attention with our hats off. It was that good. After that we ate hams and eggs at the beanery, all except the hogger. He had the tallow pot bring a sandwich over to the engine.